Good morning and welcome to another Middle East Forum webinar with project directors and their guests. My name is Benjamin Baird and I am the director of MEF Action, and I'll be your host today in our discussion of Islamist anti-Semitism in the West with our guest, Yehudit Barsky. Just a few notes before we jump in. Our interview will last for 30 minutes, but I encourage our viewers to leave their questions in the Q&A box below. We'll get to as many of these as possible in the final 10 minutes of our presentation. Following today's webinar, you can find a copy of this conversation along with our other webinars at MEF's YouTube channel. Our guest today is Yehudit Barsky, a veteran Middle East expert with a special interest in the place of Jews in Islam. She is currently a senior research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. She holds a BA and MA from New York University. Welcome, Ms. Barsky. So let's jump right in. Let's start with the root of the problem. In a landmark 2023 study of Islamist anti-Semitism in the United States for the Institute of National Security Studies, you wrote, quote, "The expression of anti-Semitic ideology by Islamist movements is primarily based on their leaders' extremist interpretations of Islamic sources. How is anti-Semitism a scriptural problem within Islam?"
So first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this issue today, which is something that's become more challenging as time goes on. So I would say that it's a combination of issues. Number one being you have holy texts and who is interpreting them. And you have a particular group of people, you have Islamists who are interpreting them in one way. You have others who don't interpret them that way. And the question is always who is interpreting the text. So you have, there are texts that are used by the Islamists that go back to medieval times, which denigrate Jews and refer to Jews as being the enemies of God, the enemies of the religion of Islam, because there was no Islamist movement at that time. And then there are people in the current Islamist movements who believe that they must use these texts, that these are very important to use. And on the other hand, there are other people who have rejected that, namely the countries that are now engaged in the Abraham Accords, who are not promoting that type of ideology. So, and I refer to it as ideology because, again, although they're trying to say we are the only representatives of Islam, of the religion, in truth, they're trying to essentially hijack the representation of Muslims and say we're the only representatives, and try to say that anyone who says anything different from us is not legitimate. So there is a question of particular texts that are being used, such as Ibn Hazm, as well as more 20th century texts. Ibn Hazm's medieval text, which says essentially that one of the accusations that Jews corrupted the Torah, that Jews are evil people by nature. And then you have the more modern interpretations by Sayyid Qutb, the ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, who not only expresses anti-Semitism based on Islamic sources and essentially told his followers these are sources that are important to use, but built upon them to the degree where he essentially encouraged his followers, saying that they are going to be the ones who are going to destroy Israel and essentially destroy all of the Jews, finish the job of World War II, finish the job that Hitler started. So that is, there's a combination of those things, and it is more complicated to tease them apart, but essentially you have these movements that insist that these are important interpretations and that they're the only interpretation, and that's the problem that we're facing.
Sure. We see anti-Semitism, though, across the political and sectarian spectrum among some Muslims. The problem extends from conservative imams to progressive activists who don't always fit the classical definition of Islamists. Therefore, is anti-Semitism an Islamism problem, or is it an Islamic problem? And I think you answered some of this, but are there some other common factors at play that drive anti-Semitism?
There is anti-Semitism that comes from medieval sources and Islamist sources, and then you have the phenomenon that Bernard Lewis pointed out in the 20th century, the adoption of European anti-Semitism, and essentially that became dovetailed with the previous sources that existed in the Middle East, in the Muslim world. So today it's not very different, unless you are studying this for quite a long time, but essentially it's not very different to go from the portrayal of Jews in some of these other sources that I mentioned as being the enemies of God on a theological level, the enemies of Islam, the enemies of Muslims, to the very horrific depictions of Jews during World War II, and the Nazi broadcasts, which were essentially taking advantage of these kinds of images of Jews and trying to expand them, trying to make them more palatable and make them more widespread among people in the Muslim world. And I would say, as we are experiencing in certainly the late 20th century and early 21st century, because of the internet, because of all of these concepts and ideas being able to be reprinted, republished, and reposted, particularly in social media, you really have at this point, I would say many people even can't tell the difference between the types of tropes that are anti-Semitic that originate from Europe, and the tropes that originate from what were medieval Islamic sources and Islamist sources in the 20th century.
Definitely difficult to distinguish. You write about the beginning of Islamism in America through the growth of campus clubs like the Muslim Students Association. How have Islamists grown and expanded since then, and how are they using their newfound political clout to advance anti-Semitic ideals?
So it's there's a bit of a long answer. I'll try to make it shorter.
Sure.
So essentially, the first Islamists who came to the United States were people who followed the Muslim Brotherhood ideology as well as Jamaat Islami ideology, and they began as students, and then as time wore on, they became businessmen and doctors and lawyers, etc., social scientists, and they started to organize organizations that are all connected to the previous organization. So they started out with Muslim Students Association, and then they started out with the Islamic Circle of North America, which was Jamaat Islami in the United States and Canada, and then moved on to other organizations dealing with particular issues such as the conflict in Kashmir, the Palestinian conflict with Israel. So you have various organizations. So the Islamic Circle of North America took upon themselves interest in the Kashmir conflict in particular, but there are also smaller organizations that were concerned about the Kashmir conflict. And breakaways from the Muslim Student Association were which eventually became large organization, the Islamic Society of North America, which became the umbrella organization over the Muslim Students Organization, but it encompassed and enveloped all of these societies, which were first graduate students and later people who were professionals. And today you have a larger and even larger umbrella organization called the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, which includes all of those organizations. You have people from the Muslim Brotherhood, the people from Jamaat Islami, people who are concerned about the Palestinian cause, American Muslims for Palestine, the Council on American Islamic Relations. So all of them are under the U.S. Council on Muslim Organizations, as well as many others. So they changed their to some degree. They maintained the previous names that they've had, but by going under this umbrella organization, they're trying to project more unity and try to gain more legitimacy and ultimately gain more political influence as well as societal influence in the United States. So to say that you are the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, it's a national organization representing what they're projecting as everyone in the Muslim community. And again, their position is that they are the only ones who represent the Muslim community. I'd like to point out something from the study, which I think is very important for our viewers to know, as well as others. And that is, there was a Gallup poll, an Abu Dhabi Gallup poll that was done in 2011, in which they asked Muslim Americans. They had a large sample of Muslim Americans, and they asked them, does any Muslim organization currently existing represent you? And 52% of the women, I'm sorry, 52% of the men, 55% of the men and 42% of the women said no Muslim organization represents us. So you have a significant number of people who say that they're not represented by an organization, and that's where I think there's leeway to talk about what could be done later in our conversation.
Sure. So we get this question often, and I'll pose it now, perhaps preempting an audience question. But what, in your estimate, is the most dangerous Islamist group in America today when it comes to anti-Semitism?
So I think that we need to take a step back for a moment, because if you say only one, then you're going to miss the forest for the trees. And when I say that, I'm looking at this from the perspective of many of these organizations have a particular purpose that they're either founded for or that they're engaging in right now. So when you look at them and you see what they're engaging in, so some are engaging in political activity, some are engaging in interfaith activity, some are engaging in looking into attaching themselves to American grassroots organizations, particularly in the progressive sphere. So for me to say only one is the most dangerous one, I think really takes away from the fact that there are challenges all across the spectrum. And so just to give you an example, a lot of people like to talk about the Council on American Islamic Relations because of its prominence. Yes, they are, absolutely, no question. But you have, as well, at the same time, we have the Islamic Society of North America engaging in interfaith dialogue and gaining more and more legitimacy in engaging in interfaith dialogue, as well as other organizations engaging in interfaith dialogue. So because of that situation, I think we need to look at this as in a holistic fashion and examine what each of them is doing. Each one of them has a particular part of society that they're trying to attach themselves to and gain more legitimacy in. And so therefore, I think it's a bit of a misconception to only look at one organization.
Sure, that's a good answer, and I think you're right. In an unusual development, some of the most bigoted Islamists have positioned themselves as spokespersons against anti-Semitism. In June, Biden rolled out a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism that included CARE, which you just mentioned, as one of its partners. Likewise, the media now increasingly turns to groups like CARE to respond to incidents of anti-Semitism, from simple vandalism to violent attacks, but never anti-Semitism committed by Islamists or Muslims. What explains this mainstreaming of Muslim anti-Semites as public champions in the fight against anti-Semitism?
So I think there's a parallelism that the media would like to see of one minority defending another minority. And then you have something that the media has completely missed with regard to these organizations. And that is that as at the same time as they're saying or making some kind of comment against anti-Semitism, they are very much on the march, challenging the legitimacy of the mainstream Jewish community, attacking mainstream Jewish communal organizations, and essentially saying that the mainstream Jewish organizations do not have the right to interpret what is anti-Semitism, which would never happen for any other community. If you would go to another community and say, You can't define the hatred against you. We're going to define what is hatred against you, and we're going to decide what that is. People would be the reaction would be, I think, quite extreme. So, nevertheless, these groups are saying that the Jewish community, and particularly the anti-Semitic watchdog, the oldest, I would say, anti-Semitic watchdog organization of the American Jewish community, that they are not a legitimate organization. They should not be part of the they should not be part of interfaith dialogue, that they should not be considered part of the progressive sphere, progressive politics, etc. Attacking these mainstream Jewish organizations and trying to delegitimize the leadership as it is right now of the American Jewish community. And so therefore, that's not being noticed in the media. And it's not just the anti-Semitism that these groups are engaging in, but it's also a campaign. It's a boycott campaign, a delegitimization campaign. And that's the reason why it's not just one organization. We really need to understand that this is all across the board, and we need to deal with it as well.
You write about a well-documented RedGreen Alliance, whereby the Democratic Party and progressives have legitimized Islamist anti-Semites. However, we're starting to see the beginnings of an alliance between political conservatives and Islamists, mostly over issues related to family and sexuality. The mainstream right has traditionally supported pro-Israel policies, as we know. Is this relationship between Israel and the GOP endangered by this new alliance? Or will conservative Muslims and Republicans stick to these narrow family issues and ignore differences over Israel?
So with regard to the Red-Green Alliance, there's a long history of followers of Islamist movements who actually came from communist and Marxist backgrounds. So that's just a very interesting history of modern Islamist movements to begin with. But with regard to what looks like something new, I would point to meaning that these groups now have taken a second look at conservatives in this country. The truth is, prior to 9/11, they were courting conservatives. They were courting the Republican Party. They had some smaller organizations that no longer exist at this point that were courting the Republican Party at that time. Their idea has always been, it's not only the family issues, it's not only to try to engage with whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party on narrow issues. The idea is to empower themselves to become influential and to push out again the same kind of idea, the same strategy that they would be using in the Democratic Party and among the progressive space will be the same type of strategy that they would try to use in the Republican space on the right and the conservative space on the right space. They will try to do exactly the same thing. There is no such thing as for them as we only have a narrow interest with conservatives. Their idea will be they want to bring more of them to power, bring more of them to be members of the party, bring more of them to be involved, and to change the nature of the policy of the party as it exists now. So that's their perspective. That's where they're coming from. And I would caution anyone who thinks that it's only a narrow interest on their part, because we've already seen this 20 years ago, prior to 9/11, and then after 9/11, many of them it took a couple of years, but many of them took steps back from being involved in the Republican Party because of the strictures, the security strictures after 9/11. So this is, in a certain way, history repeating itself, but I think this time around it will be for the long term and the long run, because they've seen success on the other side of the spectrum.
Sure. So Islamists do tend to be very entrenched into politics and media, interfaith groups. What can we do to stop Islamist anti-Semitism?
That's a long answer as well. We could talk about that for a few hours, actually, but I think number one is education, that the media is unaware that these groups are anti-Semitic. A lot of journalists don't have the background to understand where these groups have come from. I also think that from the standpoint of a larger concept of what we all need to do is we need to find more allies, the Jewish community as well as others in the United States. We need to find allies. The interests of the United States as a democracy need to fight against extremist groups. In other words, there's already been an understanding that there are white supremacist groups. We need to deal with fighting against those groups, and that's become very prominent in the media. People are very aware of that, more aware of that. But when it comes to these groups, people are not aware of that. They're not aware of their anti-democratic nature, their ideology, which is anti-democratic, which is anti-Semitic. So I think that a lot of people in the United States would understand, not just Jewish people, that fighting anti-Semitism is also part of the larger protection of democracy in our country, and that we need to educate people about this. I would also say that since the Abraham Accords, there are other Muslims who do not believe in this ideology, and that in the wider community that we need to find those Muslims and work together with them. There already are efforts by the Jewish community to do that. So we need to find other voices in the Muslim community who do not promote anti-Semitism. And that's something that Daniel Pipes has said many, many times, that the solution to this problem is to find and work with Muslims who do not believe in this ideology. And of course, Middle East Forum has many, many, many friends, as I see being interviewed for the webinars. And I think that people have not really thought about trying to actualize working together with people who are not promoting that ideology, that we need to reach out to them, we need to talk to them, we need to find ways to cooperate. And I think that there are human rights issues that many of the Muslims, whether they be from Iran and other places or the Abraham Accords countries, that they find common cause with people who are fighting anti-Semitism, because those who oppose the Muslims who are trying to speak out for women's rights they're anti-women, they're anti-feminist, they're also anti-Semitic. So I think there is a coalition that could be built, but that's a question of working on it and finding the right people.
Thank you. We're in our final 7 or 8 minutes here, so I want to get to audience questions. We have quite a few, so we'll answer as many as we can. The first comes from David Levine, who asks, Islamic spokesmen frequently insist that they're not anti-Semitic, just anti-Zionist. What's your response to this gambit?
So when you talk about the only Jewish country in the world and say that Jewish country needs to be destroyed, that's anti-Semitic. You're saying you want that genocide must be committed against that country. That is anti-Semitic. It's not just against singular Jews. And when you say, as many have had said from these organizations or these movements, and more broadly, that Jews deserve to be killed, that Jews should be destroyed, and repeat and republish the ideological texts of Sayyid Qutb, as well as other ideologues of Muslim Brotherhood and Jama'at Islami, etc. When you republish that, essentially you are promoting anti-Semitism. So when people say, I'm only criticizing Israel, but when you see people saying that Israel needs to be destroyed, that essentially is anti-Semitic and is no longer a criticism of the policy of the country. Criticism of policy of the country is legitimate, but when you say the country itself needs to be destroyed, and that you're going to, these are movements that are being supported, that particularly those who are sympathetic to Hamas, which believes in that, in destroying the state of Israel, that's where you cross over the line.
Steve Gerzoff asks, how do we publicize or expose the tenets of some of these, quote, holy texts, such as Reliance of the Traveler from the 14th century?
How do you, I'm sorry, how do you
How do you
publicize them?
publicize or expose the tenets of these texts, some of these anti-Semitic texts?
So I think part of this is that people need to, as with any idea, you need to write about the ideology, and people write op-eds about these kinds of things, or they write, or particularly if a particular text is being distributed, and point out who's distributing that text. In other words, again, this is part of education. You need to educate people that that certain texts are being distributed, or that when someone there may be someone who quotes from a particular text and point that out.
Barry Werner asks, why does the world refuse to see the Arab-Israeli conflict as just one of many fronts of the global jihad war? Aren't the 9/11 attacks on the US and attacks on Israel part of the same phenomenon?
So that essentially, if we go back to many years prior to 9/11, to 1998, Al-Qaeda actually announced, it was called the Islamic Front to fight Jews and Crusaders, and that was when Al-Qaeda made its declaration of war against the United States. But the name of the umbrella organization mentioned Jews, and essentially that says everything. Their ideology, in their ideology, they believe that Jews are part of a wider conspiracy against them. So they declared war against the United States, but they also included in that war against Jews, against Israel. And although it's less well known, Al-Qaeda has targeted Jewish targets as well as Israeli targets. So it is part of the wider global jihad against countries, the Western countries throughout the world.
Roz and Michael Shorenstein ask, how does Islamist anti-Semitism differ from Soviet-style anti-Zionism?
So I mentioned a little bit earlier that there were Nazi broadcasts to the Arab world, Arab and Muslim world. In the 1970s, there as well was a campaign by the Soviet Union to promote anti-Semitism in third world countries, but particularly in the Arab world and the Muslim world. So there isn't so much of a difference. The only difference is who was promoting, for example, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So in the 30s and 40s, it was the Nazis they were broadcasting anti-Semitic sermons and anti-Semitic broadcasts throughout the Middle East. And then later on, you had the Soviets doing the same thing, as well as republishing the protocols in Arabic and republishing other kinds of things in Arabic to promote anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories throughout the region. So there isn't that much of a difference. The only I would say the only small difference is you're talking about promoting European-style anti-Semitism into the next generation. And we are seeing the effects of that now. Of course, there's many generations, several generations since World War II, but we're certainly seeing the effect of the Soviet propaganda and the Soviet promotion of anti-Semitism even now.
Well, I think we have time for one more here. It's from Andrea Spindle, who asks, can you speak about specific funding or support of Iranian regime Shia mosques in the West, US, and Canada? Kind of a different side of the coin we haven't discussed yet.
Right. So there have been some mosques that have been under investigation by the American authorities for their connection to the Iranian regime. And right now, we don't have the time to get into details of that, but there certainly have been followers of the Iranian regime in the United States who engage in demonstrations, pro-regime demonstrations. They also engage in anti-Israel demonstrations and talk about obliterating Israel. So on the face of it, it looks like an anti-Israel demonstration, but ultimately they were talking about genocide of the only Jewish state on the planet. And so this is just a little bit of an idea of what's going on. But they are definitely Islamists. There's no question about it, and there is definitely activity by them in the United States and as well as in Canada.
Sure. Well, that's about all the time we have today, Ms. Barsky. How can our viewers keep track of your work or get in touch with you if they'd like to discuss Islamist anti-Semitism?
So I have a website, Yehudit Barsky, one word, .info. And you can contact me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. We'll make sure to include that link in our YouTube video that we post afterwards. So thank you, Ms. Barsky, for this fascinating and important discussion. Thanks to our guests for tuning in. You can watch all of our project director webinars on Mondays and Fridays, and you can tune into our Israel update every Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.